Welcome to Well Read Magazine's First Look. I'm Robert Gwaltney. Joining me today is Jeffery Lofton, my friend and co-host, and we are both so excited to enter into conversation with award-winning author Paulette Kennedy. Welcome, Paulette.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
We're excited to have you. So before we get started in our conversation, I'm going to share a little bit about you with our listeners. Paulette Kennedy is the best-selling author of The Witch of Tin Mountain and Parting the Veil, which received the prestigious HNS Review Editor's Choice Award. She's had a lifelong obsession with the Gothic. As a young girl, she spent her summers among the gravestones in her neighborhood cemetery, imagining all sorts of romantic stories for the people buried there. After her mother introduced her to the Brontes as a teenager, her affinity for fog-covered landscapes and haunted heroines only grew, inspiring her to become a writer. Originally from the Missouri Ozarks, she now lives with her family and a menagerie of rescue pets in sunny Southern California, where sometimes on the very best days, the mountains are wreathed in fog. Paulette's next release is The Devil and Mrs. Davenport, a mid-century domestic Gothic set in the Missouri Ozarks about a housewife who develops psychic abilities after a viral illness. And that book will make its way into the world March 2024. Paulette, this first of all, congratulations. I've read the book and I love it. I could not put it down. It was an extraordinary read. Why don't you set up The Devil and Mrs. Davenport for our listeners?
Sure, thanks so much, Robert. So, The Devil and Mrs. Davenport is set in 1955 in Missouri in a small, well, kind of middle-sized town named Myrna Grove, which is fictional but based strongly on my actual hometown of Springfield, Missouri. And the main character, Loretta, wakes up after having a horrible flu and discovers that she's developed psychic abilities that enable her to hear the dead and see the dead. And this coincides with the disappearance of a young woman from the area. And Loretta begins seeing visions and hearing this young woman's voice and gets embroiled in helping to figure out what happened to her. So that's kind of the basic premise of the book. There are a lot of overtones and undertones of religious trauma and small town antics that kind of happen among the neighbors and the colleagues of the Bible college that her husband teaches at.
Paulette, you mentioned it said in 1955. Is there something about the 1950s? I mean, the social zeitgeist, mid-century politics, popular culture, anything that drew you to that time period?
Yes, there was so much that was going on in the 1950s. It was a major decade that had a lot of change, a lot of social change, a lot of political change. It was a very affluent decade during the Eisenhower administration. Veterans were coming home, beginning their families. And so we had the baby boom, and there were just so many different things. There were the early stirrings of what would become the rights movement in the 60s and 70s. And so there's a lot of material there. It makes for a really good playground for fiction. One of the reasons why I chose the 1950s, I was very inspired by the work of Shirley Jackson, who wrote during the 1950s and was herself a housewife and author, like Loretta becomes within the scope of the novel. And I was inspired by a lot of her domestic memoirs during the time period. And there was a lot of paranoia also in the 50s socially. The Red Scare happened, the civil rights movement, desegregation, so many things where people who were felt other, felt somewhat singled out and under the microscope. Shirley Jackson and her husband Stanley both were under suspicion for being communists at one point in time when he was teaching at the small college in the Vermont town that they lived in. And so there were a lot of social and political things happening. And as a queer person, I kind of saw an opportunity to use Loretta's psychic abilities, which make her feel like an other, as a metaphor for what queer people go through with the suspicion and stuff, and especially um, concerning the reading material that Loretta gets involved in. I saw parallels between what I witnessed growing up in the evangelical sphere to what's happening now with book bans and books being outlawed in libraries and schools that focus on queer interests and queer concerns.
Hmm.
So on social media, I've noticed that you've been showcasing vintage recipes. Share a
Yes.
little bit about your research for the 1950s for that time period.
Well, I always start out with a wide angle view of whichever era that I'm writing in. So I'll read general histories and biographies from the era. So I read a biography of Eisenhower. I read several nonfiction works, which are listed in the back of the book, about the 1950s and the Cold War. And also, I read a lot of memoirs that were written during the era, not only Shirley Jackson's domestic memoirs, but I also read some memoirs from a wife or a daughter who was writing about her mother, who was a 1950s pastor's wife. And there were a lot of different avenues that I go down when I start researching, but certainly cookbooks, magazines, periodicals from the era. All of those are rich, rich resources to pull from because it lets you see how people actually lived in the era, which to me helps me have a little bit more of a realistic portrayal of my characters.
What would you say is the most delicious vintage recipe that you've prepared so far?
So far, I think that the Valentine pie that I
Like
made
good.
first, the very first reel, I really loved it. My husband and son didn't really like it so much, but I really liked it. And then the Jello salad that I prepared this week was surprisingly good too. That brought back a lot of nostalgic memories of like church socials and family reunions and things like that we had growing up, where there was always a Jello salad on hand.
Always, always, especially in South Georgia, always a congealed salad.
Yeah,
Yes.
been getting a lot of congealed salad recipes in my social media feed, things that are prompted to me, which I don't know how it happened. I think they're reading my mind, revisiting my childhood. But yeah, I think everyone of a certain vintage can certainly relate to the Jello salads.
Yes, they were big all the way up through the 70s and 80s too, which I grew up in the 80s, so we always had them.
So, that's kind of a light, Jello salad. That's, joy and light and, family, but you're a gothic fiction writer. For our listeners who
Mhm.
might not be familiar with that genre, tell us tell us about it. It seems darker than Jello salad.
It's Gothic fiction is an interesting genre because there are so many subgenres within Gothic fiction, and certainly Shirley Jackson, when she was writing, she liked to show a little bit of the subversive side of suburbia, and that was my main inspiration with this novel, was to kind of show the darker side of that perfect like nuclear family that everybody envisions when you think of the 1950s. But Gothic in general is a curious blend of genres. So you've got horror, you've got mystery and suspense, thriller, and you've also got a little bit of romance sometimes with Gothic. And it's really like a pervasive sense of dread that something's about to happen, which Shirley Jackson was absolutely masterful at doing. Sometimes it just snuck up on you, like the actual horror that happened in her work, and sometimes it would take a slow build. Like I think of books like We Have Always Lived in the Castle. She was really good at like manufacturing unreliable narrators and such in her fiction, and there were people, very flawed characters, and everybody had a secret that they were hiding. And I really tapped into that a little bit more. I recently watched a movie called Don't Worry, Darling, and it was set at the outset. I don't want to give too much away about the movie in case people haven't seen it, but that same kind of feel, like this idyllic, like community, this insular community of people that seem very, very supportive of one another. And then there's that slow building sense of dread. to where by the end it's an absolute horror story. And so I wanted to kind of tap into that. There's a lot of nostalgia in this book. I've gotten that comment from a lot of early readers. There's a lot of happy, like lighthearted stuff in the book kind of early on. And then as the story progresses, things get a little bit more and more sinister. And that was my goal. And I definitely studied Jackson's work. I read her entire catalog as I was drafting this novel. I reread even like some of her lesser known works to kind of get a little bit of a read on how she was able to create that sense of dread.
Mm.
Loretta Davenport, the protagonist of your novel, where did she come from?
Loretta herself is a little bit of an amalgam of people. Definitely my mother informed her characterization a lot. My mother married very young the first time at 16 years old and grew up in a very, very strict religious family, and kind of had a lot of issues with abusive marriages and such. And so she really helped inform a lot of Loretta's characterization. There's a lot of me in Loretta, especially the feeling like an outsider, and some of the things that Loretta experiences kind of parallel some of the things that I've experienced. And also Shirley Jackson also helped inspire her a little bit, just more with on the surface things, like with Shirley balancing being a homemaker and being an author, and balancing, trying to find her own identity against the mores and expectations of the 1950s, which a lot of women encountered during that time period. We'd just come out of World War II, where a lot of women were called to the workforce while their spouses were away in the war. And then as soon as their spouses returned home, they were expected to go right back into their role as a wife and a mother. And that domestic role started to grate on a lot of women. And there was like this undercurrent of frustration that was running through women, where they were feeling more and more constrained by their domestic roles. So she was really just a mirror of everything that I witnessed with my mother and my grandmother, and then what I myself went through like in my early 20s. So yeah, she's one of the dearest characters to my heart, because I feel like in many ways she's the most like me.
Mm. Mm.
What surprised you most about her in writing her? Did she shock you along the way when you were in the midst of the writing process?
What shocked me the most about her was how clear her voice was, how she really showed me how she wanted to be on the page. Not quite as much as Gracelyn, who was one of my main characters in The Witch of Tin Mountain, who I almost felt like I was actually channeling a spirit whenever I was writing her, because her voice was so strong. Loretta's voice was strong, but it was strong in a quiet way. It was one of those characters that seemed to grow more and more attached to the story as the story came along. And so I really just tried to get a read on who she was and what motivated her, and that helped inform how the plot developed.
I'm interested to sort of pick at that thread, I guess, a little bit. Mentioning how Loretta came to be, but I'm wondering if your impetus to commencing a novel is it from a fully developed story arc populated with primary and secondary characters, or do you start with the germ of an idea, the germ of a character, and as some authors do, and find that well developed characters then dictate their own stories? Could you tell us more about how it happens for you as a writer?
Sure. It's a little different for every book so far, anyway. My first book, Parting the Veil, I mostly was inspired to write a classic Gothic romance. And that was the plot. It was a little bit more of a plot-driven novel. I feel like Eliza, of course, I was attached to her as a character, but some characters really come to you very strongly, like they did with Gracelyn and The Witch of Tin Mountain and Deirdre. And that book, I feel like, is a little bit more character driven. And so with The Devil and Mrs. Davenport, I had the germ of who Loretta was. Like the first thing that came to me with that book was the title. And I started asking myself, who is Mrs. Davenport? Why did I think of that name? And what does she have to say? What does she want to say to me? And I started honing in on like the background that I wanted to portray and what I knew from living in a town that was very much like the fictional Myrna Grove. And that informed my arc and how I wrote her story. The book that I just turned in is a little bit more of a plot driven book, but also there are a lot of things that I wanted to say. Sometimes it's theme, you know, sometimes there's a theme that I really want to focus on. And so with book 4, I wanted to focus on how the elderly are treated and viewed by society. And so I created those characters to reflect my own experiences, having been both of my parents' caregivers, and how I came to realize that our bodies get older and begin to betray us, but inside our spirit and who we are never really changes, at least not in a really big way. And I have, as a woman of almost 50 years, I can tell you that there are days where I still inside feel like I'm 19 or 20 years old and I'm still figuring things out. So I wanted to honor that. Like, I really feel like in Western society, sometimes that older people aren't necessarily given the respect that they deserve. And they're kind of viewed as a little bit more of a burden. And I wanted to write to that.
Yeah. You know, speaking of being who we are deep down inside and that being the essence of us, no matter the age of our bodies,
Mhm.
are there female protagonists in literature? You mentioned you read the whole Shirley Jackson's whole catalog, but are there other
Mhm.
female writers or female protagonists you've read who somehow informed your portrayal of Loretta?
You know, I've thought about that a lot because, you know, when we're pitching a project, we always have to think of comps. It's like, okay, well, do we have a comparative novel that and I really had a hard time with comps with this one. And honestly, I couldn't tell you of another female character that kind of reminds me of Loretta. Not that I think that what I wrote was very, very unique or special, but I haven't found a character. Maybe the closest would be Constance Blackwood of We Have Always Lived in the Castle.
Mm.
Constance maybe would be a good comparative character because Constance always tries to be perfect. You know, she's always trying to please everyone. She's very much a people pleaser, whereas Mary Cat's a little bit more rebellious, but also fiercely protective of her sister. And so I think probably she would be more in line with what Constance tries to be, although Constance, you know, is definitely more of that kind of debutante type figure that we see a lot in Southern literature. But yeah, I liked that whole novel on how the sisters, women working together to solve problems, is a theme that I kind of revisit over and over in my work.
Right.
I love We Have Always Lived in the Castle, and I think you and I have chatted about that before, Paulette. It's a favorite novel. Jeffrey, have you had the occasion to read Shirley Jackson's We've Always Lived in the Castle?
Yeah. I love Shirley Jackson.
Yeah,
Just
she's wonderful. Well, we'll have to have a Shirley Jackson book club,
We
certainly,
will.
after we have our Paulette Kennedy book club. One of the things that our listeners, we have readers and other authors who are kind enough to tune in, and oftentimes they're interested in hearing about the publication journeys of other authors. Do you mind sharing a little bit about that?
Sure, I'm happy to share. So I've been writing pretty much my whole life. I was an avid reader at a young age. I started reading before kindergarten. My mother taught me. My mother was always handing me a book. We were always going to the library. So my love of reading started very young. And I feel like my love of writing kind of branched out of that, as it does for many of us. And I started pursuing commercial fiction as a possible avenue for something that I wanted to do in my college years, but I didn't really go after it in a big way until I got into my 40s. And I was 42. And a big reason for that was that I couldn't finish a novel length work of fiction until I was 42 years old. And that was a manuscript that ended up becoming Parting the Veil. So I finished that manuscript. I put it through several robust edits, one of them with the help of a freelance editor named Maria Tureau, who really helped me hone in on what I was trying to say with that story. And I started querying, and I had some interest from agents, but there were no takers. So I didn't really get an offer until almost at the end of the life of the manuscript, whenever I was ready to put it away and start on something else. I decided to enter a Twitter pitch contest, which is no longer going, called Pit Mad. I wrote some pitches with the help of some friends, and the pitches ended up going viral. And I got an offer from my agent, who's still my agent, 2 weeks later. So that was kind of how I got representation. And then after that, we pitched the novel to several editors, and I got my offer from Lake Union a few weeks later. So that's kind of the long and the short of my journey from being a novice author to a published author. But like, as far as writing craft and stuff, I feel like I'm always learning. I'm always a student. In fact, before I begin writing my fifth book, I'm going back to craft books and studying them, because I really want to make my fifth novel as strong as it possibly can be.
Wonderful.
What would you say, Paulette, held you back from being able to finish that initial manuscript?
Perfectionism. Perfectionism has always been my most difficult. I'm very self-defeating that way. And it's been something that has plagued me since childhood. And I think it was because I had so little under my control as a child, because we grew up very, very poor. We didn't really have electricity and reliable plumbing and everything whenever I was growing up. And so I became a very anxious person, I think, because of that lack of stability. And so my perfectionism manifests whenever I'm trying to control things that I can control. So I think with fiction, I would get in this loop of where I would go back and I would constantly be reworking things that I had already written, and then I would just get burnt out, usually about the 10,000 to 20,000 K mark in a manuscript, and I would abandon it. So I have a graveyard of about 10 partial manuscripts that I might revisit at some point in the future, now that I know I can actually finish a book. But yeah, I think that perfectionism was the root of all of my issues with not being able to finish.
Well, you've obviously moved beyond that obstacle, Paulette, and I'd like to, talk a little bit about how you feel that your writing has evolved since Parting the Veil.
It has evolved a lot. I feel like in how I approach my process and my craft from the early stages, because when I wrote Parting the Veil, I quote unquote pantsed that novel. I just sat down and I started writing, and I wrote it very quickly, which shocked me. I wrote it in about 2 months' time, and that was really kind of surprising, but it needed a complete rewrite. That's the thing. So this is the difference between me. There are some people that can sit down and write an absolutely marvelous work of fiction with pantsing or flying by the seat of their pants, discovery writing, however you want to class it. I am not one of them. If I try to do that without any kind of structure, it'll fall flat and I end up having to do a complete rewrite. So I've started embracing the synopsis and embracing the outline. And so that's how the biggest change that has happened with when I first started Parting the Veil to now, where I will sit down and I will actually think about the things that I want to convey in the plot and with my character before I ever start drafting.
So, Paula, one of the things that strikes me about you is that, of course, not only are you a gifted author, but you're also a very good literary citizen. Talk about, yeah, you've been so kind to me and you're very supportive of Jeffery. Talk about your writing community and what it means to you.
The writing community is everything to me. Sometimes I get a little bit emotional because I know that I would not be where I am without my fellow writers. I would not be where I am. And so that gratitude, so many people helped me that I feel the obligation to extend that back. And especially with newer authors who haven't quite broken into the industry yet. I do a lot of beta reading and critiquing for people that I've met in the writing community. I feel like I'm a fairly approachable person. I'm not intimidating. Um, and I think that helps a little bit with building the community that I've built. But I do want to continue as long as I have the energy to do so, and as often as I can, to be a good literary citizen, as you put it, Robert. And you are a phenomenal, you and Jeffrey both are phenomenal literary citizens yourselves. You help so many authors, and I see that, and it's just beautiful. It's very gratifying because I really believe at the end of the day, we're all in this together. I'm not a competitive person when it comes to my craft. I'm not competitive when it comes to a lot of things. I just want to see us all succeed. And it makes me so happy to see another author, especially someone that I've seen come up from the querying trenches, go on to be this just phenomenal, like, best-selling author.
Well, in the words of Robert Gwaltney, there's room for all of us.
Yes,
It's really,
it's a big table.
Yeah, that's really what Robert's all about. I don't want to put you on the spot, and when someone asks for a list of things, inevitably something gets lost or someone gets left off the list. So, can you name a few people who are really your champion
Yeah.
when you were first starting out? Anyone come to mind?
Well, I have so many. Maria Tarot, Jenny Chappelle, both wonderful freelance editors that do so much for the writing community. As far as fellow authors who have always supported me from the very, very beginning, people like Hester Fox. Hester was one of the first people to blurb me, Megan Chance, Elizabeth Blackwell. A lot of authors who are with my publisher as well have been very supportive. My friend Monsi Shaw, she and I are critique partners, and she lives in LA, so we go to lunch a lot, and her support is so special and evergreen to me. There's so many. I'm going to be leaving someone out too,
Yeah.
because I just have my community, I feel like, is so robust, and of course the two of you, like, I'm just so grateful. I really am, and I really try to, like, be there for everybody, and sometimes I miss things because I'm trying to be there for everybody. But those, like, really close authors who have just always shown me, like, and also I want to mention Agatha Andrews with She Wore Black podcast, who, when we first started out, she interviewed me for my very first novel, and she was just starting her podcast at that point in time. And now her podcast is huge, and she gets all these, like, A-list authors on her show. And we kind of came up together, and I love that. I really do.
Oh, great.
Wonderful.
Thank you for telling us about them.
So we are getting close to the end of our time together, Paulette. It's gone by swiftly. Before we part ways, what's next for Paulette Kennedy?
Well, what's next for me is that I am going to start drafting my 5th manuscript soon. So I'm in the research phase right now. I'm in that broad spectrum. I kind of enjoyed writing Loretta's story in the 50s, and so I want to continue with this, hopefully, next book. I can't really say too much about it yet because we haven't pitched it yet. But it's kind of an exciting concept and a little bit outside of the realm of what I've written in the past, but it still has that Gothic flair to it, and that slow building sense of unease. So it's set in California too, which I'm really excited about because I live in California. And so it's been fun to set a lot of my books in the Ozarks, and I've enjoyed going back to the place of my birth with all of my fiction. But this one is going to be something new and fresh, set in the California desert, and I'm super excited about it.
Wonderful. So, Paulette, thank you for joining us. Jeffrey and I wish you every success with The Devil and Mrs. Davenport. It was a wonderful book. I loved it, and I urge all of our listeners to get themselves a copy. Gentle
Thank you
listeners,
so much, Robert.
You are welcome. It's our pleasure. So until next time, I'm Robert Gwaltney for First Look.
And I'm Jeffrey Dale Lofton. And remember, to be creative is to be courageous. Thanks for joining us.